Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Darius Lakdawala. I'm the Director of Research at the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. I'd like to welcome you to our Schaefer Center hosted webinar on measuring real-world effectiveness and value. This is the second webinar of our four-part series. Next Tuesday, as you can see, we have a webinar on using precision medicine in clinical practice. And the following week, we'll discuss how we can pay for this innovative area of medicine. We especially want to thank the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. AHRQ invests in research to improve the quality of our healthcare system, and it provided funding for this series. As a reminder, none of the views expressed today reflect the official positions of the Department of Health and Human Services. Today's program will include brief remarks from two distinguished panelists, which will be followed by a moderated panel discussion and question and answer with the audience. Audience members can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Let me begin by introducing the two distinguished experts who are going to join me today. Dr. Kay Larholt is the Director of Research at the MIT Newdigg Center for Biomedical Innovation. She's a seasoned statistical professional with 30 years of experience in the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device industries. More recently, Dr. Larholt has applied her expertise to the production of real-world evidence using platform strategies to aid in the decision-making of downstream stakeholders, patients, providers, and payers. So welcome, Dr. Larholt. I'd also like to welcome Megan O'Brien. Dr. Megan O'Brien is the Executive Director within the Global Market Access Organization at Merck. In this role, Dr. O'Brien leads the Policy Evidence Research Team, which focuses on generating evidence to inform policy-related discussions around access to pharmaceuticals and to contribute to real-world evidence, health technology assessment, value framework policies, and standards development. In prior roles at Merck, Dr. O'Brien was responsible for the development of economic models for several pharmaceutical products and for value and evidence strategies and real-world evidence studies for vaccines. Welcome, Dr. O'Brien. Kay, I'll start by turning it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Darius. Good afternoon. As Darius said, I'm Kay Larholt. I'm the Director of Research at MIT Newdigg. Newdigg is a safe haven think and do tank. We're a multi-stakeholder collaboration, and our mission is to drive more value faster to patients in ways that work for all stakeholders. We have other projects at MIT Newdigg that you can find on our webpage, but our LEAPS project is the most relevant to today's topic of precision medicine and value assessment. The LEAPS project deals with the sustainable patient-centered innovation, and specifically, we're thinking of what happens when the promise of biopharma innovation, that's where the R&D that's happening all the time, where precision medicine lives, what we call the upstream system, meets the realities of value-driven healthcare. How do we manage to allow that the new developments that are happening day in, day out in the biopharma world to reach the patients that need them so much? The healthcare system is what we call the downstream system. So LEAPS is our project that tries to bridge that gap between the R&D, biopharma innovation, and the healthcare, downstream healthcare world. And specifically, we're looking at the capability of getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, which sounds very much like precision medicine, except now it's in the downstream system rather than the upstream system. And one of the things that we've realized over time is that the investment in the downstream system reduces the risk of investment in R&D and increases the impact of things like precision medicine on patients. So LEAPS takes a systems approach to real-world learning that benefits all the stakeholders. The stakeholders are shown here on the left. These are not all the stakeholders in the value chain, but they're certainly some of the key stakeholders. And they all produce data on a daily basis from their work but the data they produce is not sufficient for the decisions that they have to take and make for the treatment of patients, for the paying coverage of drugs, for the using of the different prescribed medicines. So LEAPS is working on a multi-platform learning engine that will allow the decision makers to not only use the data that they provide, but the data from all the stakeholders to improve their decision making. And one way that we're doing that is by using the LEAPS Learning Lifecycle Framework. This framework connects real-world evidence planning, production, and use to optimize drug therapy regimens. It's been said that learning stops at the time of approval. It's also been said that you can't only do any more one study at a time to answer one question. It's just not efficient. So the LEAPS Learning Cycle Framework takes the production piece of this. It's using platform strategies to make this evidence production more efficient and sustainable. But once we've created that evidence, it needs to be used. Conventional wisdom is that it takes 17 years for research evidence to reach clinical practice. So one of the reasons we have plan in here is such an important piece of this is that we have to make sure that when we're planning the evidence that we know that there's a way of getting it disseminated, adopted, and potentially changing policy and practice standards. We don't only want to use the evidence that is produced, but we also want to incentivize new real-world evidence production, sorry. So I look forward to our discussions today about the generation and use of real-world evidence for all stakeholders and decision makers in the downstream system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kay, for some excellent remarks that are opening us up today. Megan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Darius, and thanks, Kay, for that presentation, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Megan O'Brien, and I don't have any slides, but I am going to speak to three main topics. The first is the need for using and applying real-world evidence in a broad definition of precision medicine. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we in industry currently generate and use real-world evidence and some thoughts for the future. So when we talk about, for the first topic, when we talk about precision medicine, what do we mean? Targeted therapies for individuals or groups to optimize outcomes generally. This is commonly applied to genetic characteristics and used in oncology, most often folks are familiar with, but can also include other factors that may be revealed through analyses of real-world data beyond just genetic testing, such as environmental or lifestyle factors. Information that may be captured through asking patient-specific questions or captured through aggregation of clinical data or other digital sources could also inform these different factors. You could ask questions like, could certain characteristics associated with medication adherence be revealed through real-world data analyses so that treatment regimens or different dosing options could be tailored for different groups? These are just some of the ways we can think about precision medicine and how the evidence comes to bear on it. For the second topic, in the industry, we're committed to understanding how our products perform in the real world, and certainly optimizing outcomes is very important. So we generally have robust real-world evidence plans in the disease areas in which we have products, and this information can be used in all stages of drug development and product life cycle. During drug development, we often look at epidemiology that can inform the understanding of natural history of disease and the development of relevant endpoints for clinical trials. Real-world evidence can also provide inputs for economic models. Once the drug is available, real-world evidence can be used to better understand utilization and uptake, factors affecting adherence, comparative effectiveness, as well as an understanding of the benefits and risks beyond what was captured in clinical trials. Along with data from clinical trials, it can be used to inform health technology assessment and other value assessment decisions, and can help in the development of clinical guidelines and to inform healthcare providers and patients about treatment options. Incorporating real-world evidence throughout the discovery and development life cycle has the potential to reduce timelines to making a product available and potentially streamline submission processes. But where are we now when we think about how we're generating real-world evidence and what's in the future? Right now, we still take a very traditional research approach. We ask questions, we identify data sources, we run the analyses and report the results in scientific conferences and publications. We contribute real-world evidence related to epidemiology and disease burden, as I described, prior to product approval, and then work to ensure that this evidence is incorporated into decision-making as appropriate. We're also committed to doing real-world studies with scientific rigor, with pre-specified protocols for hypothesis testing studies, but there's a time lag to getting evidence into the decision-making, as Kate mentioned. This is starting to expand and resolve, similar to the work that LEAPS does. We've developed a real-world data platform to enable broader access and use to real-world data across our organization. But we need to ensure the appropriate levels of access and expertise and have governance processes in place to ensure the scientific rigor and that the right people with the right expertise have access to the data. We also need to consider how we work together with different functional areas to ensure the appropriate use and that there are no missed opportunities for using the data. All of those considerations for the traditional research approach need to be incorporated to ensure we're generating credible insights and results. And while there's a tremendous amount of very good work going on now, the future promise, as Kay described with LEAPS, is where we move from that traditional research approach that I described to this continuous learning model, where all the evidence is brought to bear for every decision, not just what has been generated from studies, but all of the evidence is constantly updated. A patient that's seen today can benefit from the evidence or data that was generated from a patient seen yesterday. And that's the real promise and the future that I hope we can all look forward to. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Megan. We'll now turn to discussion with Megan and Kay. And let me begin, Kay, with you. And in particular, you noted that the ultimate goal here is figuring out how to connect new technology to a value-based health delivery system. And in some sense, we're still getting to the value-based health delivery system part of it, but this is part of the question of how we're going to do that. So based on that fact, a key issue is, do we have the evidence we need in order to support value-based decision-making? I wonder if you wouldn't mind commenting a little bit on what the current state of real-world evidence generation is for value assessment. What gaps are there today? What opportunities are there to do better? And what are some of the barriers that need to be removed in order to get ourselves to value-based healthcare for new innovation?
Yes, well, I think both Megan and I touched on that in our opening remarks because we live this every day. What we're seeing, obviously, is that, as Megan pointed out, that real-world evidence production is done very similar to clinical trial production and to the production of evidence in the R&D, one study at a time to answer one question at a time. That while we're doing that, there's no chance that we can actually keep up with the evidence that is needed. At the time of launch, there's very little real-world evidence because that makes sense. Unless it's a second indication or a third indication, the product's not in the market, so you're not going to get real-world evidence. What you have is clinical trial evidence, which is absolutely critical for regulatory approval, but doesn't very much help those other stakeholders that need to make the decisions about the coverage, the use, and the prescribing of any kind of treatment. So what we're hoping that can happen is that as the real-world evidence, as Megan says, if we continually learn and update the evidence that's out there, as we're learning, as we're identifying subpopulations. This happens a lot in the safety realm, but doesn't happen as much in the effectiveness realm. In the safety realm, FDA and other agencies are continually looking at safety as soon as a product comes on the market through the Sentinel and other arenas. But for the effectiveness, there is really no way of doing that. There's no one centralized area. There's not even any kind of guidance around what should be looked at. And there's no incentive. Who has the incentive to create real-world evidence? Individual sponsor companies might have some incentives, as Megan pointed out, to generate certain evidence, but that doesn't help the provider that's trying to choose between 5 products or the payer who's trying to decide which of these products to put on a formulary. So these are some of the challenges that exist. And what we're hoping is that if we continue to create these platform strategies that would allow us to ask multiple questions of a system as the evidence becomes available, that this evidence will get generated in a quicker time frame and be more fit for purpose. And that's the other piece of this. Evidence needs to be fit for purpose. Much as we all, and I am one of them, love regulatory grade evidence, it might not be completely necessary to have regulatory grade evidence for every single decision that every single stakeholder needs to make.
Great. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I think so. So Megan, I want to play off some of Kay's comments, and in particular this point that real world evidence historically it's kind of done at the pace and in the format of clinical trial generation. And Kay, I think, has an interesting and important insight that just isn't quite up to the task of what we need. I wonder if you could comment, Megan, on the issue of real world evidence versus clinical trials in a couple of ways. One is what does real world evidence add over and above what we get from clinical trials, which of course are critical. Nobody's trying to abolish the clinical trial, but what are the gaps that real world evidence helps to fill? And I guess as a related matter, what are the barriers to acceptance that industry faces when it goes out with real world evidence to oftentimes a landscape that is used to clinical trials in terms of how it's generated and what it means? I wonder if you could comment on some of those issues.
Sure, thanks. And so I think one thing I've heard often throughout my career is that the RCTs are used by regulators, clinical trials are used by regulators, real world evidence is used by HTA. It's a different level or standard of evidence, real world evidence being of a lower quality than RCT. And I think you really have to look at it in terms of, as Kate mentioned, fit for purpose. What's the decision being made? What's the context in which the decision is being made? Real world evidence provides, and in my mind, it's always been, in some ways, it's irresponsible to ignore it because it is there, it's sitting there, and it can be used with the appropriate methods. So you can, the example I provided earlier, you can get information about adherence, you can get information about different subpopulations, you can get different information about different real world endpoints and how things, how they're measured in the real world that you can't get from clinical trials. It's not feasible to answer everything that you want to answer in the clinical trial. So you have to find, and all of these data are sitting there and available. So why don't we use them more? And that brings you to the barriers to acceptance. And I think that really comes from, I think, the perception that the data were not generated for research purposes. The information is not randomized. So, the patients aren't randomized. So how do you interpret what you're getting out of the real world studies, and can you use that for decision making? Do they give you good, credible insights? And I think there are, different ways to address all of those issues, starting with, addressing real world data quality, understanding where it came from, potentially improving the quality of real world data, at the source, all the way to, trying to better understand and communicate about the methods that help adjust for some of these issues that we miss when we don't randomize. The other piece I'll say is, when we say real world evidence, we often mean real world effectiveness. So we're asking a question about treatment effect, but real world evidence can generate different insights about people related to, or populations related to epidemiology and other factors, that it's not just effectiveness. So we don't want to eliminate all of those other kind of descriptive benefits of real world evidence just because we're concerned about randomization as well.
Sorry, I should note that randomization is the exception rather than the rule in my field of health economics. So I guess some might say we should therefore discard all of health economics. But assuming that you don't think that, there are methods, as you note, Megan, for handling non-randomly generated data. I think maybe continuing along those lines, Kay, I'm curious, you noted in your remarks that we're more diligent at generating real-world safety data than at generating and analyzing and incorporating real world effectiveness and real time effectiveness, both real world and real time effectiveness data. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on why that has been the case. Why is there, you also noted the importance of incentives for real world evidence generation. What are the incentive failures that plague the system today that have caused us to be in this equilibrium where we don't do a lot of that real world effectiveness analysis? And how do we address that either from a policy standpoint or a business or other organizational standpoints?
Well, if you can answer that question, then we can put LEAPS to bed, because the most important, not the most important, but one of the major things that we're dealing with during the LEAPS project, in all the work that we're doing, which we've been doing now for close to 3 years with our community and our collaborators, while it is about the methods, while it is about the thinking about how to produce the evidence and how to use the evidence, how to align the incentives has been the one thing that has continually comes up, and we know it has to be addressed, but we're still working on addressing it. But I think that the parts of the evidence that are important and people need to remember is that, for instance, patient-generated health data. We cannot forget patient-generated health data. And I'm not just talking about patient-reported outcomes that go into clinical trials. We're talking about the feelings and the impressions of the patients as they're taking different treatments. We're talking about the wearables and the digital health and all the things that now can be done. And we need to include that in any assessment of patient, of real world evidence. And again, fit for purpose. We have to remember one thing, and this goes back to something that Megan was saying, that, real world data is good enough for clinicians to make clinical decisions. Patients are treated every day by people working with real world data. Yes, they have the benefit of the research behind them, but they're looking at the data in front of them, which is the patient. So I think that we've just, while there are groups that are including patients in their work, they're not routinely included in real world evidence generation. And so, our hope is that we can continue to reduce the uncertainty around the evidence so that people can make better decisions. And that is the important, and again, it's about decision making. Doesn't mean making a different decision necessarily, it just maybe means being more comfortable with the decision you're making. But that is the hope for real world evidence. And so then you have to, as Megan pointed out, you have to match the methods, whatever they are, to what you're trying to produce so that people can use it in a meaningful way. The incentives issue is an issue that obviously FDA, because of just regulatory requirements, they have a requirement to review safety, and therefore everyone has to create and look at safety. Effectiveness is not part of the law. The law doesn't say that your product has to be better than any other product on the market. It just says it has to be better than, it has to be better than placebo. It has to meet the requirements. And so now it's up to the other downstream stakeholders to define their needs. What do they need to know? What do the clinical guidelines need to know? What do the people who are trying to make decisions about formularies need to know? And what evidence they need? If their answer is the only thing they need is randomized clinical trials, then we're not getting anywhere, because that's not real world.
Terrific. And I also want to remind the audience as we're speaking that you're welcome to put in your questions into the Q&A feature at any time, and we'll get to them later in the session. Megan, I want to pursue some of the points that Kay raised. And clearly, we know that alignment of incentives is a challenge, and there's not a single simple answer. But I want to maybe dig into that a little bit and enumerate some of the issues that we face, that various stakeholders might face. And you have certainly experience on the manufacturer side, but also you understand what's on the other side of the table from you, I imagine. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on what challenges do you see with respect to accessing and aggregating all of this real world evidence and transforming it into something that's actually useful for decision makers?
Yeah, thanks, Darius. That's a huge challenge, and I think it really stems from, who's holding the data, who's gathering the data, and it's multiple different groups. And part of what they're gathering and keeping is proprietary. If they shared it, would it be giving away? If a payer, insurer shares information, does that give away proprietary information about their benefit designs or their populations? So there are these really significant concerns about what if they're sharing, what are they sharing, and what's the impact to their business? And that's kind of spread out across the whole healthcare system. Then you have providers and healthcare systems with the same concerns. So I think when you think about incentivizing that, you really have to think about, well, what's in it for them to share? And I think, and Darius, here's a study idea for you. I think we could look at other other countries in Europe that have, these end-to-end, birth to death systems and are able to capture every little thing. And we could think about, the diffusion of innovation, how fast decisions are able to be made, and maybe do some calculation about what we're missing by not having these data sources aggregated and kind of at our fingertips like you do in other places. I think there might be, we could quantify that, count it up. But I think it comes to incentives, and it could be related to patient outcomes. Like if we could all achieve better patient outcomes by sharing these data, how do we kind of get over that barrier to make it happen and realize that benefit?
Okay, well, I have to enter the policy discussion now, because I think you've made an important point that one issue is that in a purely decentralized, privately provided information environment, there are concerns about proprietary information. The incentives are kind of fundamentally misaligned in a sense. That's part of the reason it's difficult to solve, is because you can't solve it in the context of profit maximizing firms. So then one might then jump or walk to the conclusion that the government ought to be involved in this. And Megan, you noted that that is the case in some European countries and other countries where the production of these data is considered a public function because information's a public good, because government can overcome these incentive problems. The traditional criticism of government provision is that twofold, at least. One is there's less efficiency potentially, and the other is it's not as capable of representing diverse, multi-stakeholder, decentralized systems like what we have in the United States. It'll move towards one perspective rather than many. So that's kind of the nature of the trade-off. And I wonder if I'll have both of you comment on this, but I'll start, Kay, with you. What are your thoughts on the appropriate role, if any, of the U.S. government in nurturing the production of these data, literally taking it over? What role do you think the government should play, if any, again? And what problems do you think government involvement might solve, if any?
Well, as you probably noticed from my accent, I am not American born, so I have a very one-sided view of this. But I think we have to look at groups like Sentinel, which was an FDA-sponsored endeavor, and has been very successful. FDA doesn't run the whole thing. They don't own the data. The data stays actually with the data partners, and just the questions are answered. There's a central coordinating committee that's run out of Harvard Pilgrim Research Institute. There's NEST, which is another group that is also FDA sponsored. That's the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, maybe a little bit less well known to some of our people on the line. But it is a collaboration between FDA and the medical device stakeholders, which is different. Medical devices are different, but that is they're trying to generate evidence for the whole total product life cycle of medical devices, which is much shorter than drugs. There's a possibility of using possibly of CMS through CMMI, sponsoring different projects that would provide evidence. PCORI obviously does research funding, as does NIH for this type of. PCORI definitely does it for more real world evidence. NIH tends not to be as much, but all of those could have a role, a bigger role. I think the role they need, I don't think they should be actually producing the evidence, but they should be sponsoring groups such as public-private partnerships, consortiums, multi-stakeholder groups to do the providing the evidence that's needed for the decision makers, because none of the individual stakeholders outside of the manufacturers, and this is not something that they should be doing, but the government should have a role, but it shouldn't be in actually producing the evidence, but certainly sponsoring it through things like the grants that Corey gives and other types of work like that.
One quick follow-up on that, Kay, and that's extremely informative, the range of current public sector activities we have in the United States. But it strikes me that it's an alphabet soup of different programs in the public sector today. And I wonder if you think that's good on the one hand, that it sort of maybe it addresses this issue of feeding a decentralized marketplace from different perspectives, or is it bad in the sense that, you know, maybe the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing in the government? Should there be a centralized, to the extent that you think that the government has a role to play here, which I think it sounds like you do, should that role be overseen and coordinated and more centralized, or is this let a thousand flowers bloom strategy a decent way to proceed? What do you think?
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think that that the one group could possibly do this because it is so diverse. There are so many needs. I think the example we just had with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the huge number, over thousands of individual trials that were started in different investigators by different hospitals, by different groups, with no one was suggesting they should have been coordinated by a central place, but there was no way of bringing the evidence into a central place so that people could learn from it. So it got wasted. The amount of knowledge that got wasted because someone ran a small 75 patient trial on hydroxychloroquine, which was never going to show a result because it's too small and underpowered. But if we could have somehow integrated that with all the other 500 studies that were done on hydroxychloroquine, we probably could have reached a result much sooner to say, no, maybe that shouldn't be used because it's going to harm people. The same thing in real world evidence. We need some way that the evidence can be pulled together so we can see what's happening, as you say, so the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. But I'm not sure that devices and biologics and drugs and other treatments can all be done under one roof. I think it's probably too much to ask for any group, and I think it wouldn't be very efficient.
Well, Megan, so I'm curious about something related to that question, and I won't put any words in your mouth on this, by the way, but certainly some in industry have been concerned about the fact that government itself has incentives here, that as a major public payer for healthcare and pharmaceuticals in general, there are concerns about a government role being kind of conflated with its incentives for cost cutting. Maybe it has incentives for innovation too, but there's been that concern expressed that government involvement could lead us down a path of less innovation and more aggressive cost cutting. I wonder what your thoughts are on the role for the public sector, given those concerns, or any other concerns or upside or opportunities you see for what role the government could play.
So yeah, and I think you know, when you asked the question and when Kay was talking, I was thinking about, you know, I'm not sure that it would be a positive direction to have government regulation to require anything, so then the question comes about government funding, and they're collecting a lot of this information already, right? So they are a payer, and just like all the other insurance companies, and they provide healthcare through the VA and other mechanisms, right? So they are in the mix in that ecosystem. One role that they could play, stepping, a little bit back from gathering the data and doing all the research themselves, is setting forth standards and expectations for how it could be done well. They could provide funding to other groups to do it, so it's not kind of centralized with the government. And the other thing I was thinking to kind of follow up to the previous discussion is that there's a technology solution to some of this, right? If we don't want to put all the data together, there are mechanisms to send the analysis to the data, right? So, you have to think about something that works for the US. You can't just say, okay, well, they do it in Europe, so it would work here. You really have to think about what's important to the population of the US, and Things like data privacy are very important. Things like innovation and things like, kind of allowing the market to work these things out are important. But when you have these opportunities where you really need different competing interests to work together, how do you find that solution to make them work together? And sending the analysis to the data is certainly one thing that you could do that kind of takes the risk away from revealing proprietary information, data privacy issues, and things like that.
Well, on that point, Megan, so here's kind of a hard question for you, I think, or maybe it's not, I'm not sure, because we're beginning to get at it towards the end. So if we keep the government out of it, well, except for maybe standard setting, which I take your point that the government, in principle, could set standards in a way that's divorced from any incentives they may or may not have as a payer. What prospects do we have for solving some of these really fundamental and intrinsic private sector incentive problems if the government doesn't take a more active role in generating the evidence? So this is a tough problem for everybody to solve on either side. So here's my one unfair question for you, and I'm going to ask Kay a similarly unfair question in a moment. But I wonder what you think are the prospects for the private sector to solve this problem without significant government involvement.
Well, I think what the government, what does the government have? It has kind of these policy levers, and it has funding, and it has kind of the ability to make these requirements. Could the private sector do that for themselves? I mean, you're starting to see companies come together and share data, right? There is a solution if that incentive becomes clear that they are going to benefit, right? So I don't know how to make that happen. But I think there is the possibility, and that could actually be done with the government as well. I think if you have all of the stakeholders at the table and it's not perceived as the government requiring something, perhaps that would make it more palatable to everyone involved.
Great, and as promised, Kay, here's your unfair question. I think so. As the flip side of that is, if the government does take a more active role, whether it's a single centralized or some mix of coordinated and decentralized roles, how do you prevent that from being co-opted by its incentives to cut costs aggressively as a major public health insurance payer? What kinds of safeguards or other arrangements might you envision to head that off? Or maybe you think it's not an issue. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I kind of going to tie back to the question you asked Megan and Megan's answer. So we do get all the stakeholders at the table in a small group. I mean, we're not talking about thousands. We will tend to bring 70, 80 people together, and they are all the stakeholders from that in a safe haven position. So it can be done, and we do make progress, but it's tiny because it's little pieces of progress between single groups and thinking about how it can be done. I think if you have to believe in the public good, you have to believe in the original mission of New Digs and of all the stakeholders. You have to believe that everybody actually is trying to get the right answer for the patients, that we're all trying to do best for the patients, whether you're a sponsor, a manufacturer, whether you're a payer, whether you're a provider, that's what our goal is. Because if you don't believe that, then you're never going to solve the problem. But if you truly believe that underlying it is that everyone wants to do the right thing for patients, then you just have to work out then how you do that and still let all the other stakeholders win. I mean, we joke about it at New Digs that all the stakeholders have to win, but the patients have to win the most. That's how you do it. And so if you can get to that, then I think you have a chance. But I'm not an economist. Incentives kind of get past where I kind of go with this. But I think that's the part where we would say is how we're trying to do it. And we think that there are other public-private partnerships like ours and consortiums like ours that are trying to do the same thing. And so hopefully we can all get there together.
Great. Well, so I should also note we're having a lot of fun up here, but if you want to join in, please submit your questions to the Q&A. We have a few minutes left still, but I want to turn now to something we haven't tackled so far, which is, Kay, as you've rightly mentioned, the goal here is that patients should ultimately benefit from medical innovation, medical technology, and healthcare. And indeed, that's how we think about value in economics for sure, and I think in other arenas as well. So my question really is about the so-called last mile problem. So we've talked about generating evidence among manufacturers, payers, healthcare systems, and there are lots of ways we can imagine dealing with these organizations. But how do you embed that into the day-to-day clinical decision-making of providers, particularly in such a heterogeneous system as we have in the United States? Some small practices, some large, some institutional. I wonder, Megan, if you could take a first crack at that, and then I'll ask Kay to weigh in on that as well. How do we get it all the way downstream to patients through providers?
That's the holy grail, right? And I think it's not about data, it's not about evidence, it's about communication, and it's about bringing it all together. And I know this probably happens to you. I often get questions like, what is the answer? What's the best way to do X, or what's, all your knowledge and everything. And I'm like, I don't know. You can't just take one study and answer a question. You have to bring it all together. And I don't think that we're as advanced in evidence synthesis and then incorporating that into the decision as we need to be, because it's still very much, it's like a manual process. You do the studies, you do the research, you have you have clinical guidelines developed, and then they're there and they get updated every few years, but that evidence could change in the interim. So I don't know what the answer is, but that's what needs to happen. And I think that, efforts like LEAPS, it's like this engine that's fueled by data that is constantly being updated. And that's like the future I see. I don't know how we're going to get there, but I feel like it's going to be a mix of technology and smart people and the will that you're going to put it all together and it's going to happen. Maybe the MIT students will solve it, but that's really what has to happen. And I don't know, you also know that, clinicians are totally overloaded. You can't have a million pop-ups showing up on their EHR screen. So how do you kind of leave the art in medicine and take out the uncertainty? These are all the things that need to be worked on. I think we've probably gotten better at it over the years, but we still have a long way to go.
Well, let's ask this question. Put it this way, Kate. So how do we get the engine, the new DIGS engine, all the way to the doctor's office? How do we drive all the way there and embed it in that literal point at which the patient is receiving care?
Well, and that's, if you remember my learning framework, that's the use, is making sure that any evidence that gets produced is used. And we're working on different technologies and ideas and things that will help with that. But as Megan said, we can't overload the physicians, but just the clinical guidelines. There are clinical guidelines. I think the cardiology world has something like 2,000 different clinical guidelines. On the other hand, you have other groups that have clinical guidelines that are just updated every 4 or 5 years. That's not a potential. The American Diabetes Association tries and does live updates of their guidelines, but it doesn't help that we used to have a guidelines clearinghouse that was helping set standards for guidelines and work on helping the groups that set the clinical guidelines, and that is no longer existing. So there are things that could be put in place to help the physicians to get there, but it is going to be hard. But anything's got to be better than trial and error, and that's what we have. That there are sometimes in decisions that the clinicians make that they say, I don't know which of these 5 drugs are going to work for you. The evidence doesn't tell me. The information's not out there. We're going to have to try one. Oh, well, actually, your insurance company tells me I have to try that one first, so we'll use that one. Or I'm just going to try the one that I like the best because I've used it the most. And then we'll see how you're doing in about 6 months and decide. We all know that can't continue. And so for patients' benefit, we have to find a better way of doing things and creating better evidence that is fit for purpose, that so it meets the needs of the people making the decisions. That's what's going to do it. But the technology and the systems that have to get put in place, we're far away from actually getting there.
Well, I guess on that somewhat hopeful but also challenging note, I think we've learned that we all share the same goal. I think that's good news. And I think it's good news that a wide variety of industry stakeholders share that goal. There's work to be done for sure, but there are also institutions pulling in the same direction. So I think we can all take some hope in that. I want to thank Dr. Megan O'Brien and Dr. Kay Larholt for joining me today. It's been an intriguing and stimulating discussion, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks, and have a nice evening.